Testing. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Dylan. I'm a research analyst with Masari. I cover the DePIN sectors, infrastructure, and RWAs. We're here to talk about a new proposal for a energy subnet on helium. We're joined here by Scott and Fredrik. I'll let them introduce themselves.
I'll go first. So my name is Fredrik Ahlgren. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Sourceful. We're based in Sweden, by the way, so if you don't find the accent, you know now. So.
They gave me one. Hey everybody, Scott Sigel, COO of the Helium Foundation. We started the foundation about 4 years ago as the kind of steward for the coordination layer on how we scaled the original IoT network for helium, running the governance process, which allowed us to scale and build up the mobile side of the network, and basically governance, advocacy, protocol engineering, all the stuff that you typically hear from the foundation side.
Great. Fredrik, why don't you start out by telling us about what Sourceful is, what problem you're solving, and how does DePIN come into all of this?
Yeah, so we can start with the problem, and it's actually been a quite good introduction because we've had other projects that have been both presenting and being talked about. So we've heard Daylight several times during the main stage. We just had Glow up on stage, and there are more players in this space. So essentially the problem, and this is that we are now, even though we're not seeing it, in some kind of disruptive revolution in terms of the grid. So all the electricity that is produced is getting more and more decentralized. And that's actually really cool because it plays really well into the crypto and the DePIN space just by this, like, people are more and more the ones that are buying production that actually produces the electricity for a grid. And the grid isn't built for this. It's that simple. The grid is old as hell. We're talking about more than 100 years. I think 1893 was the first grid in San Francisco in the US. I tried to read up on this yesterday. But, but it's old, and it's made so we have these large utility companies that produce power in coal or nuclear or hydro or whatever, and then we have consumers that wake up in the morning, they take a shower, coffee or whatever, predictable patterns and predictable production. That's like the keywords. What we now are entering is an era when we have decentralized, unpredictable production and also consumption with more and more EVs. So that's a challenge that we need to face. And the solution to this is to actually very simple. We need to connect the decentralized energy resources. And if we were building this from scratch, it's actually really strange that the regulators didn't sort of say that if you're putting some kind of production plant in your home, you need to also have a control switch of some kind on it. That doesn't exist. The majority or almost all solar panels out there, they produce power when sun shines and don't give a whatever bad word you can say about what the grid needs. And it's all about balance. Grid production and consumption always needs to be the same. Every second, or even fractions of a second. It's that simple. So that's the demand problem, and that's what we're trying to solve. And obviously with the DePIN approach. We're based in Sweden. We start with the demand side in Sweden and Europe. We see that we most likely will enter the US market and perhaps even Australia quite soon. High renewable penetration, higher demand for these kind of services.
Awesome. Let's turn to Scott. You've been with Helium for a few years now. In 2022, you guys introduced a network of networks model. Could you speak a little bit about what has been the biggest change since then and how Sourceful potentially comes in to that model?
Yeah, so I think that kind of context and narrative matters here in that, with Helium, it was one of the very early DePIN plays that had the location mattered, that the geography mattered. So, sometimes we talk about kind of compute or kind of rendering networks. A lot of these things don't necessarily have a location-specific network. And what Helium built beyond an IoT network in the early days was this massive physical footprint alongside what we kind of think about as this economic and social coordination layer that has scaled significantly and globally. 2022, we started talking about this concept of network of networks. Well, what does that mean? That sounds like a marketing buzzword. It's the idea of how do you kind of build networks and think about kind of the composability of those layers. So moving beyond IoT to mobile, it was the idea of the community existed, the physical footprint existed, the governance model, all these things already existed, and how can we reuse these and create kind of more utility where the value can accrue back to that same community. So you're creating supply side stickiness, more opportunity, and creating more economic value out of that. That was the idea behind Network of Networks, and it was really thought initially through a wireless lens. Over time, some of the lessons that we learned was also in terms of what was the right type of fit for teams to be joining as a subnetwork, but also from a technical perspective, what are the things that we've had to build that are necessary as we expanded beyond IoT into a mobile network where you had to think about kind of data compute and ingestion and what those pipelines look and how you manage that, where that stuff scales horizontally, where it doesn't have to be specific to wireless. It's much more of where there are other utility networks that can be built. And enter in Sourceful, who they've been in the Helium community for a while. They understood what was being built at the supply side, engaging with certain types of hardware. They knew this as you guys were running Helium miners years ago.
Yeah, we've been doing that for quite some time before. Also, we started. We still do, obviously, but I think the hardware. That's one of the points that we should probably address. Is that like the big why? Why join the Helium network? Because that's one thing that we've, perhaps there are questions in the audience that wants to ask the same question, but hardware is one thing. It makes sense. It makes sense from actually utilizing the existing hardware. We are able to push out the firmware update to potentially 1 million hotspots. Not all of them are connected, but let's say a couple of 100,000 at this moment.
I think it's so much of what is composable within the existing ecosystems. What can we leverage? How can you create, a larger opportunity for people who have been part of the Helium community for so long, where it doesn't have to be exclusively wireless, that everybody gets to be their own utility conglomerate because you can do multiple things with the same hardware, with the same physical location, and utilizing an existing coordination layer.
That makes sense. Scott, could you talk a little more about what other potential use cases for Helium sub-DAOs might emerge? We're seeing a lot at this conference about logistics, DeSci, other sectors. What are you seeing as potential next steps after an energy subnet?
Yeah, you think about the fact that there's already so many other DePIN native teams that are using Helium. Whether I know the Demo guys are here, Hive Mapper, so a lot of these other sensor networks that make sense. Whether XM, so a lot of sensor networks that are already utilizing Helium. There's other things that we can create greater scalability. Where again, this is a tide raising all boats of the things that we have built that we have learned through the IoT network, through the mobile network, as far as how you think about managing, a lot of teams are confronting the same issue of how do we think about decentralizing our Oracle framework? That's stuff we've been thinking about, and how do we create composability out of those types of layers? So whether you're talking about sensor networks, whether you're talking about energy, whether you're talking about edge compute, a lot of these things kind of work and can kind of play together symbiotically. So a lot of the stuff that you hear in these other conversations around DePIN, where physical location does matter, pretty much any of them can kind of work together, and that's what we're thinking about, not just what are the technical components, but very much on the economic side of how do you make sure that the value can accrue out to these subnetworks appropriately. And that's one of the most exciting areas of where we're evolving as a network now, is rethinking our economics such that, HNT is still kind of accruing its value across the layer horizontally.
And could you guys share what's kind of the anticipated timeline for integrating an energy subnet and kind of what we might see next from Sourceful?
I can. Yeah, we actually no not days. We actually published a rough timeline in the community Discord just a couple of days ago, and we believe that we will be up and running. The beta program is already up and running, I would say. So I mean, we are already doing dual mining with Helium hotspots, not on scale. So I would say the next couple of months, it will be a lot of integration with the Helium wallet and integrating so we sort of fit into the... I would say directly after 2025, in the very early, we'll probably see the network live.
I mean, one of the exciting things here, again, in terms of the composability of hardware, is how much you can kind of leverage the existing IoT hotspots. Number one, running data through the IoT network, but also, again, kind of leveraging those to kind of support the energy network as it comes online. Not to mention throwing out a quick shout, the idea that we are also now finding these kind of pretty cool unlocks of how you can convert IoT hotspots into potential data-only hotspots for mobile. So there's a lot of great stuff that's happening in terms of how we are leveraging the supply side to support what's been significant demand, both on mobile and what you can kind of see the inherent demand on energy.
Great. Now we're going to open up to the audience for Q&A.
I have a heater for Scott.
I think I know where this is going to go.
There have been other sub-DAOs that have flirted with becoming a Helium sub-DAO and chosen not to in the end. Why do you think that Sourceful was different than Wi-Fi DAO or something else? Or what was the massive difference in that?
Yeah, not the question I thought you were going to go with. But I think that part of it is also like some of it really is some of the intangibles on kind of the right team, thinking about kind of go-to-market, thinking about what makes sense as far as, I mean, one was the fact of, we were talking to a DVPN and that just was simply like, it wasn't a good team, it was a good fit, and ultimately, like, I don't even think they're in operation at this point. So I think long-term matters, and some of that is you can't, like, I think for Sourceful, like, they had been in the ecosystem for 2 years. That's not something that you can just kind of throw in a pitch deck of just like, oh, like, here's where we align. Like, seeing that alignment to part of the original core ecosystem and kind of where it goes and where it makes sense for hardware integrations, for that kind of multi-mining opportunity within the network. It's just stuff that I think we had to learn over the course of a couple of years. I think some of the areas where we've had challenges is, again, around like kind of demand-side value accrual. And that's where really the conversations we're having right now is how do we think about evolving the existing tokenomics such that sub-networks are not competing with each other for treasury. And that, I think, is really the next big step for us, is making sure that and I don't want to get too into kind of like how we compute like treasury score, but I know this is stuff that people have asked, and it's really, this is the next big evolution for HNT and Helium, is how we think about that value accrual and how sub-networks are not necessarily competing for that treasury.
Yeah, and if you want to dive into my thoughts, you can actually read a little bit of an opinion piece in the Helium proposal on exactly that topic. So,
over on the left.
Are you able to talk to what the current payback is on the Helium miner and what you think it might be within 12 months?
I honestly can't. I can't speculate on number one because I don't control the markets. In terms of what the value is of an IoT token or a mobile token. So, yeah, it's.
Assuming the current price, so assuming the price doesn't change, you buy it.
Are you talking about for an IoT hotspot or a mobile hotspot or an energy? Yeah.
IoT.
Proof of coverage was kind of the novel case within IoT of that. That's where we were able to scale up the supply side significantly, and that solved that cold start. How do you build a wireless network where there isn't necessarily a clear demand side to satisfy? With mobile, you had a flagship demand side product. I mean, Helium Mobile, I hope everybody here is signed up and using this, but that was a flagship demand side product where you could serve that demand immediately, and that's how we started thinking about stuff in terms of how do we do hex boosting and coverage boosting. So where a lot of these teams are talking about medallions now, we didn't have that in the IoT network. So when you look at IoT now, when people onboard an IoT hotspot, I would say 80 to 90% of IoT hotspots that are coming online right now are data only, and they don't care about rewards. The value is just a permissionless open network where you can create coverage for smart sensor devices. Like, that's the value prop now. Like, any of these teams in supply chain and logistics are not putting hotspots on for a return on their investment from like proof of coverage rewards. It's because it's an open permissionless network that allows them to satisfy a commercial need. So I don't really think about the IoT network in terms of a payback model at this point. It's much more about the ability that didn't exist within a private IoT network historically.
So I think I misunderstood. I thought Sourceful was contributing into the value of the IoT.
Oh yeah, in the sense of, I mean, you want to talk
Yeah,
about
in some sense, I mean, this is sort of an indirect value. Yes, we will be able to utilize. It will be DC burn, yes, and what we already know is that there will be a need for lots of additional sensors. A gateway isn't enough. So in terms of regulatory markets, I would say in Europe, in most countries, you might need like a certified, mid-certified energy meter of a certain standard if you're going to prove that you're transferring X amount of energy. Like you might not be able to trust the inverter. That is a connectivity problem, and obviously that sensor will utilize the IoT network because that's also a value proposition for us. So if we're going to build a gateway without this, we would have a connectivity problem on top of what we're trying to build. So actually, it's actually a good bridge to what you just said. For us, the IoT network is a clear value of creating connectivity. And it's also clear value because the people that are doing this, even though it's not much, I don't know, let's not speculate in that, but it's still something. It's a token that you actually get, and you get it in the same wallet app, and it's the same hardware. So that makes sense, I guess.
So how do the hotspot owners benefit?
So, I mean, so number one is the most obviously like multi-mining, honestly. The idea that you can support and run two networks off of the similar hardware because these things are complementary of, am I creating, IoT coverage? Am I creating, again, kind of power generation distribution, mobile networks? So it's, the value to the supply side is the idea that like you're supporting multiple networks through one piece of hardware potentially. Like that is kind of the idea that it's creating stickiness in the supply side of, IoT is mostly mature right now. IoT coverage at this point is stable. The idea that there are commercial operations running, there are flood detection networks, air quality metrics, supply chain logistics, like these things run on IoT. Like Demo running the macaron connectivity is because that network is stable. How do you provide some more benefit to the supply side? You can introduce additional networks. So that's again where I kind of joke about everybody being a utility conglomerate is, if I'm not going to get the best return on the more mature side of the network, what is coming into the network that is seeing either potential new upside, or if you fast forward by 10, 20 years, enough networks with enough steady demand side traffic that now you basically de-risked your ability to kind of run these nodes, and there's enough demand across these different networks. So that's kind of where, again, it's just more of the diversity of the supply side now that benefits the community who are hosting these locations.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, why don't we wrap up with one more question. Fredrik, obviously you're starting out in Sweden. Could you go a bit more into your plans for expanding Sourceful through the energy subnet or otherwise more internationally?
Yeah, so I think for the demand side, I think building the network side, that I can be clear about that. We will have this kind of baseline rewards. And we've actually copied that model from the demo project because we thought that was a really nice way of telling it. That's the equivalent to proof of coverage if we're going to talk about helium IoT. Anyhow, that will be global from directly. So we will build the network globally. And that's the cool thing about DePIN. Like we will be able to actually have a lot of distributed energy resources connected somewhere in the US before we actually have set up a demand side. But I would say Sweden, yes, will be first. We're already in concrete discussions, and this will most likely happen already this autumn, that we will actually get paid for some kind of services. And then the Europe market is very much standardized in terms of the energy market, so that's probably our home market in the beginning. Depending on the amount of our next seed round, will probably accelerate faster or a little bit modest in the US and Australia in parallel. But I believe early next year for US.
Great. Are there any resources or social media where people can learn more?
Oh yes, we have a website. We're happy to go in and there. You'll find us in our Discord. You can ask any questions, and obviously a good way to actually interact with us at this moment is also through the Helium Discord, where we have a sub-channel discussing the improvement proposal, and then you actually get answers from a lot of community members in the Helium subnetwork, which is not related to Sourceful at all, but they are so invested answering questions for, like, that's the best thing about the Helium community. It's great.
That's the thing that, again, we talk about composability, like not neglecting that social coordination, how much that scales. I think it's, it's meaningful. So,
All right, great. Thank you so much.
thanks
Thank
all.
you. Thank you.